Okay, so it's time to dig into the challenges to achieve a sustainable food system. This year, the Eat Lancer Commission provided the first set of global scientific targets for healthy diets and a sustainable food system. But translating these global targets into action is the challenge. In this session, we will explore the importance of setting scientific targets in achieving health and environmental goals. So, we're going to welcome our panelists. So, please welcome Nigel Topping. He's the CEO of We Mean Business. Thank you, Nigel. Also, Gerbrand, Haverkamp, Executive Director of the World Benchmarking. Please welcome Vennard, Program Director of the World Resource Institute. Thank you, Daniel. And Katrine Schjønning, she's the Chief of Public Health for the city of Copenhagen. Thank you, Katrine.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And before we begin, I would like you to take a minute to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you are doing.
Thank you, Vanessa. Morning, everybody. It's my first EAT Forum. I'm delighted to be here to learn a lot more about the food system and all of your work. I work in a coalition called We Mean Business, which is a collaboration of NGOs working with the business community to accelerate action on climate change. And we've put science-based targets at the heart of that work. Just to very briefly explain how that's gained momentum, in like 2013, 2014, pretty much across the corporate world, there were many companies setting targets, but they were kind of random. They were like 3%, 17%, 20%. And there's a gradual realization amongst many colleagues that businesses needed much clearer guidelines so they could say they're doing enough to be ahead of the inevitable policy wave, or to say that they're playing their part, whether they see it as a risk management or as an ethical issue. And so the idea of science-based targets for climate was born then and launched in 2014, and just in the run-up to the Paris COP. So that involves taking the then 2 degrees, now 1.5 degrees scientific work, which had also, of course, been negotiated, and doing the very detailed methodological work to translate that into a methodology which companies could use to say, we have set a science-based target, and then to have it approved by the partners developing methodologies, WRI, CDP, and WWF. And now today, over 560 companies have committed to setting those science-based targets. And it's very important because it covers the whole value chain. So it's not just at their own factories, but their suppliers. And it starts to influence politics, because those companies then call for countries to set net zero targets. And of course, many of those companies are in the food system, and we have just launched the Science-Based Targets Network to now extend that approach from climate to water, land, oceans, and biodiversity. And maybe I'll say a bit more about that and how people can get involved later on.
Thank you, Nigel. Gerbrand?
Thank you. So my name is Gerbrand Haverkamp. I'm the Executive Director of the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is fairly new. But for those of you who were here last year, I wasn't on stage, but it was the then CEO of Aviva. It's a big insurance company and a big investor from the UK. And he talked here about the need to make publicly available league tables that would rank companies on the SDGs. And because investors like them, they need these objective measures to hold companies to account and to invest more in the companies that do well on these issues. So later that year, in September, we launched the World Benchmark Alliance as a new independent institution during the UN General Assembly in New York. And I am here today to talk about how we're going to translate that work of benchmarking to food. Because what we have published today, or yesterday in fact, is a list of 300 global food companies that we believe are most critical for driving change in the food system. So these would be the big ones like Walmart on the one hand, and you would have a company like Bayern and Syngenta on the other end of the food system. And I guess we need to start to make sure that these big companies that have a disproportional influence on the food system, we call them keystone actors, that they start to play their role. And when we say play their role, we mean actually taking measures that are not just incremental, but that are actually shifting us towards a transition that we need to see. And this is where we need the science-based targets. Because when we have these science-based targets and we can build them into our benchmarks, we can actually start to see where companies stand and where they need to improve. And not only can companies see that themselves, but because they're publicly available, everyone can see, including the investors in those companies. So that is what we are here to bring. We now need to develop the methodology, so this is where we welcome input from the audience. Particularly, if I can make a last point, because we've talked a lot about, of course, about the nutritional dimension, we've talked a lot about the planetary dimension, and there is a third, and I know many people will speak on this later during the day, but that is the element of people that produce our food. So if we want to see this shift, this great transition in the food system, we have to understand and we have to be very explicit on what that means for farmers, particularly smallholders in developing countries. Now, translating all of that into a methodology, we create a roadmap for companies so that they can start to act on this and that we can start to follow. And then 2030 can be uncomfortably close, but these companies have big shoulders and they know how to carry responsibility and handle pressure. And if we articulate precisely what we want from them, there's a lot we can do.
Oh, definitely. We need from everybody on the system to really create this food revolution. Daniel?
Good morning, thank you. Here in Sweden, there's a burger chain called Max Burger, and in 3 or 4 years, they've been able to reduce the sales of beef and lamb from 80% down to 67% and increase their sales of vegan and vegetarian dishes from 2 to 20%. In the UK, the University of Cambridge has changed the food that they offer in their canteens, and they've reduced the sales of beef and lamb by 54%. And in a school district in Oakland, California, they've been able to reduce the animal products that they serve to the children by 30% and cut the greenhouse gas emissions by 14%. Now, I mention these because for me, these are like super inspiring stories of what's possible when an organization sets a target and delivers a set of actions to make a change. But unfortunately, right now, they're in the minority. There aren't many organizations that are doing this. So ourselves at the World Resources Institute, along with partners at Healthcare Without Harm, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and also today I'm proud to announce EAT as well, are joining us in a new program, a program called Cool Food, which is helping to try and resolve this. And basically, the Cool Food consists of 3 key things. First of all, it works with organizations that serve food to set a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the food they serve by 25% by 2030. The second thing it does is then brings in the latest behavioral science, marketing science, and culinary science to develop plans to actually hit that target. And the third thing it does is promote it to their diners, to celebrate the cool, delicious food that is part of Eat Lancet and our sustainable future. We announced it a couple of months ago. We've already got 15 organizations on board that serve 100 million meals, and we're on track to have 1 billion by the end of this year. That's important work. Katrine?
Thank you. My name is Katrine. I'm Chief of Public Health in Copenhagen. It's my first time at the EAT Forum, and I'm totally overwhelmed with all the knowledge and scientists which are here, and I'm already very inspired by being here. Yeah. I'm also very inspired by my 3 colleagues here, because working in public health, we spend a lot of time and resources waiting for other sectors to do our work. And I think we are getting away. We've come away with making coalitions or working together with public health or climate, and I think that will bring us forward. We discussed before we came in here what will push Copenhagen and other cities forward. Will it be the climate or will it be public health? And I don't know that, but I think together we can step forward. Just to mention shortly about Copenhagen, we are involved in a project with the EAT Foundation and other partners to develop SBTs for Copenhagen, one for healthy diets and one for greenhouse gases emission. Then we are working with a company called Gel Architects, which are well known for their urban design, to map the foodscape in certain neighborhoods of Copenhagen to see what influences the people's choices, what they eat when they live there. And thirdly, we will also work with the capacity and competence of the public kitchens in Copenhagen in order to help them becoming better at serving healthy and sustainable diets. at the same time, we expect in Copenhagen that by August we will have a new food and meal strategy which will evolve around healthy and sustainable diets. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us in your beautiful city. Well, before we start with the conversation, it's very important that we all understand that the science-based targets are basically the steps that we need to follow in order to create this healthy and sustainable food system. So basically, it's kind of a roadmap of what we need to do. So the first question is for any of you that would like to answer, and is how are the scientific targets of the Eat Lancet report being used in setting science-based targets for your city, for your business, for your organization?
Yeah, maybe I'll say a little bit about the Science-Based Target Network, which was just launched in Singapore last week. The Science-Based Targets Network is going to be a big collaboration. There's over 25 NGOs working with the business community and the conservation community. And as a sister organization to the Earth Commission, which Johan Rockström, of course, key actor in the Eat Lancet, I hope I get to see him later, I saw him on stage earlier, to make sure that the best available science is available for, it's really a work of translation. Right, so knowing that we need to get to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees isn't very helpful for Walmart or Maersk Shipping or Heidelberg Cement. So what do they have to do by 2025 or 2030? And then if you start looking at the other environmental externalities around the food system, like water and land, it gets even more complex. You know, water, you're having to make allocational decisions about, at a water basin level, how much water is needed for society, for ecosystem, and for business needs. So you have to have rigorous methodologies which business can implement, so they're practical, but which are rigorous enough, so they're science-based. So that work on climate is very well developed now. It's been going for 5 years, but it's really just starting to take off in the other areas. So the work of the Eat Lancet Commission will be one of the key inputs into the Science-Based Targets Network, as the groups on water, land, oceans, and biodiversity, which are just starting up now. And any businesses who are interested, there's a working session on Friday at 8:45 to find out a bit more about that. So I think the Eat Lancet Commission is part of this move towards the need for clear scientific boundaries informing economic decisions.
It's also good for accountability too, right? To have this science-based target clear.
I think, well, Gerbrand can probably talk a bit more about accountability, especially in capital markets, because it's one thing to commit, it's another thing, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have to make sure that we need the targets, because otherwise there's accountability on what. And so this is absolutely fundamental. But what the benchmarks then do is, by putting them together with other society expectations, like around social inclusion, around nutrition, and the science-based targets that will emerge around that, we sort of start to create transparency and clarity on where these companies stand, and that we are particularly focused on the companies that can make the biggest difference. Because what we cannot have is science-based targets and only a small coalition of the willing that is using them. We need to make sure that the big players in the system that can drive this big transformation are actually going to adopt them. And this is where we believe benchmarks come in.
Of course. Tanya?
Yeah, and I suppose so in our area, the KFU Pledge that I mentioned, that very much comes from science-based targets. So this reduction of 25% in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 versus a 2015 baseline comes directly from the Eat Lancet kind of trajectory of where we need to go. And what we do is we work with organizations that sign up, and we gather their purchase data of the food, and then we turn it into greenhouse gas emissions, report it back to them, and then work with them on a plan of how do they achieve this. So Hilton, for example, in Europe just signed up last week. So it's like, well, take that target and then think about how do we operationalize it and how do we achieve that destination that we need to go to.
Great. And for your city?
I was just inspired by you. For the strategy that we're developing, we've proposed, it's still to be politically adopted, but we've proposed a target for reducing our greenhouse gases emission by 25% by 2025. We're working with your institute because the problem that we have, or the challenge that we face, is that we do not have a baseline. So in order to see if that's, of course it's ambitious, but it also has to be realistic. So we're working to see, is it realistic? And if we have a baseline and more data, where should we concentrate our efforts? So I think for science-based targets, it's really important for cities to know what to do and where to set their target, so we can monitor if we move forward or we actually move backwards or sideways.
For sure. Nigel, you have been working for many years to create this coalition of business that support and be part of this global transformation. Could you tell us a bit what you have seen in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I feel like, this gathering is a manifestation of something that we're all collectively learning, which is that if we want to bring about systems transformation, we better put the systems transformation ahead of our organizational or personal egos.
Yes.
Many of you will know it, forgive me those of you who don't, there's a famous Monty Python film called The Life of Brian, and there's a scene in that amphitheatre where all these little organizations who are trying to overcome the might of the Roman Empire are having stupid arguments about their names. And we all, it's funny, right, because it's true, we all recognize it, we've all had those stupid arguments with each other, all right, or one of our peers is successful and behind their backs we're like cursing them for being successful, instead of cheering them on, because the kind of systems transformation that we're all working towards is so monumental. There are patterns of behavior and thinking locked into supply chains, rules, cultures. So if we don't all come together and put the systems change first, so that's the first thing, is to recognize that if we're not really putting the systems change first, then we're not really honoring our commitment to be change agents. We're kind of wasting time and money aggrandizing ourselves or our organizations. So, and this really came, with Women Business, it came about as a result of some very good friends in the business community gathering a group of 7 NGOs together and saying, you're all lovely, you're all doing good work, but together you're a mess. You've got to get aligned, you've got to have a simple message, you've got to stop competing. So, for example, one of the reasons that the Science-Based Targets for Climate has been such a success and has built such momentum is it was born collaborative. It wasn't a WRI initiative competing against a CDP initiative, competing against a WWF initiative, all of which get 20 companies on board. It was one initiative which everybody agreed to collaborate and put their best. And as a result of that, it creates much more momentum and peer pressure from companies and political relevance. So you can point to 500 companies who've all made this commitment and engage with the government of Japan or the EU and start to have political momentum as well. So I think putting mission first, getting to know each other better so that you know each other's strengths. A lot of NGOs are quite small and a little bit have sort of existential crises of sustainable funding, which means there's a sort of competition vibe. But if you don't know your peers and what they're great at, then you can't support them, you can't cheer them on, you can't collaborate with them. So it's hard work, but without this kind of collaboration, we will not bring about systems transformation. But it's here in the rooms, we're all learning. And with the Science-Based Targets Network, which we launched last week, we spent 2 years building up, and we've already got 25 NGOs partnering and more joining. So I think that it's a learning process, but as I say, we're learning how to collaborate powerfully for systems transformation.
I love that you just say, Nigel, that in order to make progress, we definitely need to put aside our ego and think about the collective good. When I was coming on my plane from Miami 2 days ago, I have next to me sitting a businessman. He was one of the greatest producers of plastic for the United States. And I was trying to convince him that he needed to create a biodegradable line. And he gave me all these excuses about the city of Miami needs to have a better recycle system, or my peers need to go first. So how do we do for businesses to make aside their personal gains and actually lead on these issues?
Well, I think what we need to, I think what we as a community sitting here in food can be better is be very precise and granular about what we expect from business. I think this is something where we have, as a community, work to do. Because we're sort of scattering in all different areas, and there's all these different people asking different things from companies. It's not just NGOs, it's also the investors coming with their data demands, and then it's an NGO with their campaign, and then it's another collective group of companies coming with their stuff. And I guess what we've been trying to do with the World Benchmark Alliance is it's an alliance. So it's made up of now over 90 organizations. Some of them will be here, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, of course, EAT, GAIN, the Extra Nutrition Index, CDP, because we need all of them to come together and to try and figure out how do we start to speak a similar language and how do we agree on prioritizing expectations. Yeah. And so that we can make a start by making things a bit simple again. Because it's not that business is stupid, that they don't understand complicated stuff. But if you want to act and you want to work with a lot of people together and you want it to be inclusive, then we have to make things simple again. And a lot of this talk about science-based targets, it's a classic one, but the perfect as the evil of good is one that is very alive and that we need to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I sense there's two barriers that get in the way of organisations wanting to drive this. First of all is the complexity, as you discuss. Specifically, we find around what is that target, and then how do you gather all your purchase data together, and how do you figure out the greenhouse gas emissions, and then what's that target? You know, I think we need to think about how do we simplify that to make that something that's really easy for management to grasp. But the second barrier we typically find is, well, what is the way that I'm going to achieve this? So I love the ambition, but when my CEO or my director asks me, great, but tell me how you're going to do it. I need an answer. And so what we think is you also need to provide companies with that toolbox of tactics, strategies, ideas for them to then implement the strategy, because it will help them achieve it, but it will also help them sign it off.
Definitely. I think that's one of the keys to make it simple for everybody. Katrine, working for the city of Copenhagen, how the health sector has been affected by the science-based targets?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think it'll be a general question, and I'll refer to another partnership that we do, which is called Cities Changing Diabetes, which has... It's a global partnership with a lot of cities with Novo Nordisk, where we discuss ways to prevent people from having diabetes. It's both health promotion and prevention, and then how to treat people with diabetes. And the partnership gave us some scientific evidence and knowledge that we did not have beforehand. So I think, and that has guided a lot of our initiatives and policies. So I think it'll guide cities in a lot of ways. And to come back to the former point, I think it's very important to give companies and businesses the tools to have the right strategies and to implement it. But I also think it's important for cities to ask for it. So there's a supply side and a demand side, and I'm thinking of the organic conversion that we did in Copenhagen, which we're very proud of, and it took us a decade to do it, and a lot of hard work. We decided in 2006 that 90% of public meals should be organic. We reached 87%, and we're reaching the limit perhaps because we can't have the supplies that we need for the elderly people that we serve food to. It's difficult to have organic meat. So maybe we reached the limit. And we did it to take responsibility for the environment and also to take responsibility for the way we farm in Denmark. And of course, since Copenhagen is the largest city in Denmark, and we produce 70,000 meals per day, we've influenced the market. So we've also made it perhaps profitable for farming to farm organic. So I think there's a circle there that we have to work together to put the things together.
What has been the impact of that program?
I think we serve more healthy meals to our citizens, and now to look at healthy and sustainable diets, that's the next logical step that we will take. How to work with our kitchens. Again, capacity and competence. How can we work with that in order to take the next step? And organic meals has been a good, but now we have to move further. We don't monitor the public health and what people eat. So we don't have any data on it.
Wonderful. Nigel, the mission of your organization, Women Business, is to ensure that the world economy is on track to avoid the dangerous consequences of climate change by 2020. And of course, that organizations are able to deliver sustainable growth. How important is for companies to make sure that they set up these science-based targets?
Well, I mean, we think it's becoming a norm, right? I mean, I have to check the website every day. It's like 564 companies last time I checked, so I think that look, we know the science, right? That's the great. The scientific work has been done, and it's also been socially accepted on climate, right? We still have some work to do on the other areas from the Eat Lancet, right? We've got to catch up on the kind of more food-related issues around water and land and biodiversity. But as far as climate, it's becoming a norm. It's becoming, we're all using the language of science-based targets now, which we weren't using 5 years ago. It's going to be embedded in capital markets through the work of Gerbrand and others who are providing the benchmarking to investors. Increasingly, there's been a global commission that many of you will be familiar with, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, launched by Mark Carney as the head of the Financial Stability Board to the G20 group of big economies, saying climate is a systemic risk. And so that's basically the first thing that a company needs to do, is say, we've got a science-based target, because we know that policy is going to require the economy to work within the scientifically defined safe operating space. And I think you can extrapolate that argument to the food system and use the planetary boundaries work that many of these great Earth system scientists have done to say it is inevitable that we will have to change our economy and our food system to work within planetary boundaries. So figure out what the science-based target is now and start finding the actions to get towards it, because it will be demanded by consumers, by policymakers, by investors eventually. And your point about getting companies to change, I think there's some really good examples here that it's not one bullet, right? There's one person who'll be the hero, who'll stand up and be crazy. And then that makes it easier for other people to follow. And then if companies have led, then it makes it easier for policymakers to be bold, because they're not worried that all businesses, or sometimes if policy says 90%, that's a big demand signal. So we talk about ambition loops, there's sort of consumers, businesses, and policymakers. It's not going straight to the goal, but building that systemic ambition collectively.
Well, definitely, we need to be brave in order to create these changes that we want to see into the world. Gerbrand, I wanted to ask you, how, after a company set up these science-based targets, how do you make sure that there is accountability?
Well, there needs to be transparency. That's a sort of a basis, right? It's important that it's important that companies publicly commit to these science-based targets. And then it's important that they start to produce internally the data to track progress on these science-based targets. And of course, then they need to demonstrate, and then they have to publicize this data so that they can go to their various stakeholders. I think what the benchmark then adds is you start to compare it to other companies. Mm-hmm. So if you would have to look at now at a CSR report of a specific company, it would all look great, and there is a lot of great stuff in there. But how great is it? And you can only tell how great or how bad it is if you start comparing it with others. So that sort of simplicity is what benchmarks bring. And then we have to make sure that it starts to speak, that these benchmarks are not there for the sake of a benchmark, but that they start to speak to the investor community so that they can use it in their conversations and their engagement with companies. Because quite often today, these engagements, when investors talk about the food system, they go way over the top. They don't understand the real issues that food companies are dealing with. So it also has an educational purpose to the investor community so that they can play its role in keeping companies accountable. But as Nigel said, it's not one bullet. And I think there's sort of tremendous purpose that companies can find in helping the planet steer towards producing food within the world's planetary boundaries. And it's also, we see now a generation entering the workforce that is looking for companies that are true on this purpose and that are delivering on that purpose and where they want to work. And what we find with the benchmarks, what we find before in other examples, is sometimes the leaderships of these companies, they underestimate this specific, and what they face is a pushback from internally, from young people and older people within the company that says, listen, I thought I was working for a great company, or at least one that's trying to be one. So why are we low on this list? What is it that we can do? Why can't we do better on this stuff? And it's these sort of surprising ways of what we don't typically consider accountability, but that to start to emerge as soon as we make this stuff public, and that we have a language and a platform to talk about it.
Okay, I think that's definitely true. I mean, consumers are changing, and I think we are looking for companies that are not only offer a product, but also that they have a purpose behind, something greater than the gains that they can get.
Yeah. And then there's always maybe to give a shout out to the World Food Prize. Today will this year go to East West, the founder of East West Seeds. It's a company that very little of you will know, but it's a Dutch guy that had he was a seed breeder. And he didn't go and become another seed breeder in the Netherlands, because we have many of those. So he went to Thailand, and he set up a seed company there because he saw that the vegetable seeds that they use there are inferior, and that farmers have very low productivity. And what he started to do is breed for these smallholder farmers. He's now reaching millions of smallholder farmers with improved variety of vegetable seeds. I mean, he would be the star of this conference. And he's going to be a star because he's going to get a prize for the World Food Prize. But it's sort of that, I mean, he did this in the 1970s. I wasn't even born. No one was talking about this, but he had this sort of clear vision. It's got nothing to do with accountability, but a sense of purpose. And that we needed that in the 70s, and we're going to need that today.
Definitely. Daniel, what do you think setting these science-based targets is so important to achieving health and environmental sustainability?
I mean, it's essential, isn't it? I mean, I think targets have to... We have a saying at WRI, Target Measure Act. If you want to really drive a program, those three things need to be there. But maybe I can just talk to ACT quickly, because at WRI we have a program working with behavioral scientists, trying to figure out how do we get people to act in this? What's the best things to do? And what we're finding is that actually for places that serve food, there's about 50 or 60 different types of interventions or strategies organizations can do. And of them, we think 20 of them are super effective. So one of them, for example, that we've done a lot of work on is just about changing the language used to describe plant-based food. We found that terms like vegetarian, vegan, healthy, or meat-free typically suppress sales, whereas using language that's about provenance or flavour or taste increase sales. We just did a trial in the UK with Sainsbury's where we took their meat-free dishes in their cafe, changed the name of meat-free sausage and mash to Cumberland spiced veggie sausage and mash, increased sales 76%. Another example with Panera, the massive chain in the US, they had a low-fat vegetarian black bean soup. We called it Cumberland spiced black bean soup, increased sales by 18% in LA. Loads of exciting stuff out there. I know the Culinary Institute of America has been doing brilliant work with the Mushroom Council, figuring out how to blend mushrooms into burgers. I was with Sodexo just yesterday. They now, these blended mushroom burgers, which clearly reduce beef, they actually sell 900,000 of those a year. Just within the last year, they've done that. So we sense that actually there's lots of smart activities out there that could really help people hit this target. And I think they can hit it quickly. You know, the exciting thing about this space is maybe unlike energy or transport, we don't need to build a massive infrastructure for companies to make progress quickly on this. And I'm inspired about what's possible.
The power of words, it's so amazing. Christian, yes?
No, I went to a workshop yesterday, and it was really interesting. And I think when we combine, I think it's called systemic changes, or how do we do it with an issue as food? We all eat, we all sit at dinners or meals, that somehow we have to combine the systemic changes with the individual thing. And if I had the trick to do it, I wouldn't sit here, I would sit in Geneva in WH. So, but I think that's one of the things we have to consider really, really hard. How can we combine the different dynamics or traditions we have at climate or public health or the food producers in order to see how can we accomplish the change and the action which is needed. So it's not purely an individual choice, and it's not just up to the market how to accomplish it. And I had a conversation with the Sudhir, I forgot his second name, from EAT, and he said when we did the project that we can Katrine, we can evaluate very complex systems. And I was so pleased. And we had a conversation of, we have very obese young people in Copenhagen, and we would like to analyze and evaluate the food system that they are a part of. So we don't just tell them, don't eat so much and lose weight, but that we also look at the system that they live in. And I think if we can somehow combine that in the cities or in the environments where we have to actually do the action and change, we can come a long way together. Thank you.
Well, as you saw in this panel, I mean, definitely we need from cities, we need from organizations, we need from businesses, we need from individuals, we need from everyone to create this food transformation. So I truly want to thank you for the amazing work that you guys are doing, each one of us in your field. Thank you so much for being part of this change.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you.